Hello and welcome back to the channel. In this video series, I am explaining how to get a declaration of matrimonial nullity in the Catholic Church. In the previous two videos, we have seen the incapacity and the exclusion. Now we are going to focus on the error. In regards to marriage, we distinguish two kinds of error: the error about the matrimonial consent and the error about the other party. The error about the matrimonial institution and its characteristics is called error of law. The error about the other party's person and their qualities is called error of fact. As we are going to see in this video, in both cases the error about the essence causes the nullity of the marriage, while the error about circumstances, properties, or accidents doesn't make marriage invalid. Indeed, in order to want something, one must know at least its essence, its essential elements. On the other hand, it is not necessary to know something perfectly in order to want it. For instance, if I decide to go to medical school and become a doctor, I am deciding as well to study subjects as splagnology and arthrology, even if I don't know what these are. We must know the essence of things to want them, but we don't need to know all the details. For this reason, those who don't know what marriage is cannot get married. This is what happens on the ground of ignorance of the essence of marriage. In its essence, marriage is an agreement among the parties who promise to live united in a stable manner in order to have sexual intercourse and to conceive and raise their children together. Those who don't know these things cannot marry. The reason for this is that we cannot want what we ignore. For instance, if a man had been raised by the monkeys in the jungle, like Tarzan, he would ignore completely that there is a thing called marriage. Until he's not back in society and learns about marriage, Tarzan wouldn't be able to marry because he doesn't know what the matrimonial contract is about. The ground of ignorance of the nature of marriage is very uncommon. For instance, it takes place when the party doesn't know anything about sexual relations. This seems to have been the case with Queen Maria Josepha Amalia of Saxony, who had been raised in a convent and married King Ferdinand VII when she was only 16 years old. The young queen knew nothing about sex, and according to some, the wedding night was a real disaster. Terrified with the intentions of the king, some say that the poor girl wet the bed. Other sources say that the king would chase her through the halls of the royal palace. Whatever the historical truth was, the fact is that if someone doesn't know at least that the spouses must have intercourse, the wedding is invalid. Usually, everyone knows the basics after puberty. Moreover, for the nullity to take place, the ignorance about the issue must be complete. There is no need to be an expert in sexology. It is enough with knowing that the spouses are going to have intimate relations, even if all the details are not known. Unlike the error about the essence of marriage, the error about the properties of marriage does not make it invalid. The Church teaches that unity and indissolubility are essential properties of marriage. However, the Catholic Church has always considered valid the marriages in cultures in which divorce is accepted, and the same can be said about the marriages in cultures in which polygamy is accepted. In the same way, the Church believes that the marriages in which both parties are baptized are sacramental. However, no one has questioned the validity of the marriages of the millions of Protestants who don't believe marriage to be a sacrament. Here we must mention a new and controversial ground of nullity: the error which determines the will. This ground is based on an enigmatic sentence within Canon 1099 of the Code of Canon Law. When this code was published in 1983, the new Canon 1099 said that the error about the properties doesn't cause the nullity of the marriage, as it had always been understood by the Church. However, without any base on the tradition, the canon added the enigmatic clause, as long as it doesn't determine the will. Since then, no one has been able to explain clearly what this determination of the will is exactly. No one has offered either a convincing definition accepted by the majority. Regardless of this lack of clarity, the ground has become more and more popular. In some cases, the original sense of Canon 1099 has been contradicted. It would seem that all the marriages of those who have different ideas about the essential properties are invalid. It would seem that our mistaken ideas about marriage prevent us from getting married. Now, this is simply absurd, and I am going to explain why with an example. In the Gospel according to St. Matthew, we read that the Pharisees asked Jesus if they were allowed to repudiate their wives. In the Old Testament, indeed, repudiation is allowed. It is difficult to imagine a more deeply rooted mistake than this of the Pharisees, faithful observants of the law, who believed that God Himself had given this permission. However, Jesus didn't answer that their marriages were all invalid due to their determining error about the indissolubility of marriage. On the contrary, Jesus, instead of questioning the validity of their marriages, answered them. Moses, because of the hardness of your hearts, permitted you to repudiate your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. Despite all this, many serious authors have tried to give a plausible explanation to these words of Canon 1099. The arguments that I have presented here are based on the teachings of Cardinal Urbano Navarrete, one of the most respected, if not the most respected canonist of the second half of the 20th century. Next to the error of law, which is the error about the matrimonial contract, we find the error of fact, that is, the error about the concrete person that we want to marry and about their qualities and circumstances. Let us see the grounds of nullity due to error of fact. The ground of error in person takes place when the party wants to marry someone, but the person that they marry is a different one. This could be the case, for instance, if someone is married through power of attorney, or if the groom and the bride cannot see each other during the ceremony. This is what happens in the biblical story of Jacob and Rachel. The book of Genesis tells how Jacob was in love with Rachel, and in order to marry her, he committed himself to work during 7 years for Laban, who was her father. Jacob fulfilled his part, but in the wedding, Laban changed Rachel for Leah, her older sister. The error in person is an error in the physical person. Sometimes we use expressions such as, "You are not the man that I knew once," or "You are a different person." These are poetic expressions, which mean that the personality of the spouse has changed, but the person remains the same and the ground of error in person doesn't apply. The error in quality principally and directly intended is an error about a quality of the other party. There are persons who want their spouses to have a certain quality so much that this quality becomes a condition of validity for the marriage. In this case, the nullity is not caused by the error as such, but by the implicit act of the will, which renders the quality a condition for the validity of the marriage. Not all errors about the other spouse make a marriage invalid. Otherwise, no one would be able to get married, because no one gets married knowing everything about the other spouse. Evidently, this ignorance doesn't invalidate the marriage. What makes the marriage invalid is that the party wants the quality more than marriage itself. It doesn't matter what quality it is. It can be something very important or something very irrelevant. What makes marriage invalid is that the party wants that quality more than marriage itself. This error about a quality of the other spouse doesn't make the marriage invalid even if it was the reason why the person decided to get married. It is not enough, for instance, that someone married for the money for the marriage to be invalid. For the nullity to take place, the party must want the riches more than the person. For instance, if someone marries for money and then discovers that the spouse is poor, the marriage is still valid. What makes marriage invalid is that the person that married for money with someone who in fact was poor wants the money in such a way that if there is no money, they don't want to get married. All the errors that we have seen so far aren't common. The only ground of error that we see in the tribunals of the Church relatively often is the error due to fraud. As its name implies, this error is caused by a fraud, that is, by an intentional deception which is committed on purpose, knowing that it is going to cause harm. For the error due to fraud to take place, the error must be about some important quality of the other party. It must be a quality which, by its very nature, can gravely harm the life of the married couple. For instance, this would be the case if a man knows that he is sterile and conceals it from his fiancée. The repercussions would be very grave because they are not going to be able to have children. The deceiver doesn't need to be the other party to the marriage. It can also be someone else, like a relative or a friend. What matters is that the deception be deliberate. In other words, that it is made with intention to celebrate the wedding. Sometimes people don't tell things that they should have told, but they don't do it on purpose, willing to deceive. Sometimes people just forget to mention things or the occasion didn't present itself. In these cases, there is no error due to fraud. One example of this error due to fraud could be that of the movie Catch Me If You Can. Frank falls in love with Brenda and deceives her and her whole family, making them think that he is a doctor and a lawyer and that he's 28 years old. In fact, Frank never went to college and he's only 16. If Frank had married Brenda, their marriage would have been invalid on the grounds of error due to fraud. These grounds of error are not frequent. If you think that some of them fits in your particular case, always consult with an expert in canon law. It is also a good idea to ask in the diocesan tribunal for practical orientation. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, please share it with those who may find it useful. If you have questions, write them below in the comments section and I will be happy to help.